everybody, and welcome to Monday ReTsene with Pretoria Psychologists. My name is Rashope, and today I'll be talking to you about the protective factors for trauma. Please mind that these protective factors are not only limited to trauma, but may be applied for other mental challenges as well. Before we go into the protective factors for trauma, I'd like us to understand how trauma affects our health and what trauma really is. So, mental health is affected by trauma. And when we look at mental health, we may understand that it affects so many areas of our lives. And it may be looked over a spectrum. The first part of the spectrum being someone who is, for example, functioning well and not experiencing any mental health challenges. And moving across the spectrum, the next part would have someone who is still functioning well, but is probably distressed, which is still perfectly normal. And then on this part of the spectrum, we might find someone who is not necessarily functioning well because of a significant impairment to their brain or social or emotional well-being being damaged, and they cannot still be deemed ill. And then on this spectrum end, we have someone who is actually deemed ill and can be diagnosed with a disorder, for example, acute stress disorder after a traumatic event. So in the context of trauma, looking at this mental health spectrum, we need to look at three things. We would, for example, look at how severe the trauma would be, or how frequently it happened. Did it happen once? Did it happen over many occasions? And then also whether the person actually tried to deal with the trauma, and to what extent. Considering all of those factors, we would then determine where along on this spectrum of mental health the person is, whether on the side of the good mental health state or on the ill side of the spectrum. So what is trauma, we may ask? Trauma may be experienced with either physical wound to the body or emotional or social or psychological shock. And those shocks may then have sort of long-term consequences. Why these long-term consequences happen is really because these traumatic events come unexpectedly, and usually when a person is unprepared, they cannot prevent something, right? So then it really has a great shock to the mind or the brain. And with these cases, we see them through your natural or your physical disasters, as we have been seeing of lately at KZN, for example, with the floods. And then we can also see these with grief or rape cases or even violence. And it is of importance to note that someone does not necessarily have to be within those traumatic events in order to be traumatized. You may just need to witness the trauma or even just hear about it over media, for instance, in order to be traumatized. So trauma really can be affected into one's mental health state in easy ways. So onto the protective factors. How do we then prevent ourselves from experiencing long-term consequences from traumatic events? We then have these levels that we can look at it, where there's an individual protective factor, family protective factor, community protective factor, and societal protective factors. With the individual protective factors, we are looking at whether a person has a positive attitude to life or whether they have high attributions or rather aspirations about the goals that they have set for themselves before or after the trauma. And when we look at the family protective factors, we're looking at specifically whether that family can create a safe environment for the person to actually, for example, express the emotions that they are feeling about the trauma, which obviously protects the traumatic, or rather the consequences as a result of the traumatic event. And then we'll also look at the financial stability of the family. whether this person can be taken to a mental health service to further debrief the trauma when we have a person who has experienced any traumatic event, for example, gender-based violence. And then onto the community sort of level of protective factors, we then have your cultural values, for example, or whether in the first place is there access to those mental health services that one needs after a traumatic event. Then onto the societal protective factors, we have your laws or your regulations as implemented on the sort of national basis. And these would be, for example, let's use the GBV example, where a person reports the case and we need your societal services like police officers to run through with the case and actually help report the social justice of the violence, where then that person feels empowered when actually laws are implemented to protect them from the person who violated them, for example. So all of these protective factors really aim to buffer the consequences that traumatic events may come with, and that is what they ultimately do, to promote mental health instead of mental illness. And these can either be present or absent, and it may be seen that the more protective factors are present instead of absent, the better in one's life. The more one will be able to rather heal through the trauma instead of be more on the mental illness side of the spectrum when we look at mental health states. So should we find it difficult to actually like either indicate or implement protective factors to deal with our own traumas, it is highly suggested that you seek professional help. But for this episode, I do hope that it did shed some light, and thank you for joining us.